What's up everybody, I'm Derek, this is Rocking E Forge, and today I am going to be rebuilding my Mr. Volcano Hero 2 2-burner propane forge. Now as you can see, this poor forge has been through quite a bit. Unfortunately, a lot of the refractory cement has chipped and crumbled off, and it has nearly uncovered the whole top refractory blanket underneath. It is all chipping off and coming apart. So the intent will be to recast this, but keep it otherwise the same. So I'm gonna get started pulling all of this extra cracked refractory cement out of here. I'm gonna go get some eye protection and breathing protection while I'm doing that, so I'm not inhaling any of the fibers or the dust off of this refractory cement. And we're gonna get ready to re-rigidize the blanket that's in there. Hopefully I don't end up ripping out a bunch of the refractory blanket with it. So without any further ado, let's get rocking. And my editor is going to put some awesome music in here while you watch me do this in fast motion. The edge on this thing, I just opened this package. Thank goodness I make my own punches and chisels, because it's pretty rough. So I have gone through the trouble of chipping out all of the old crusty refractory cement out of the body of this forge. However, that leaves all of this refractory blanket, this KO blanket in the forge, completely open to the air. And because I don't know how well you can tell, because this is kind of a wool fibrous insulation material, it's very unhealthy to have any potential for those fibers to go airborne and me breathe that in. So in order to compensate for that or correct that issue, Mr. Volcano sells a rigidizer, just a spray, 1-to-1, this and the same amount of water to spray onto the KO blanket to hopefully, theoretically, prevent the release of those fibers into the air. So that shouldn't be a huge deal because I am going to fully cast this in refractory cement and pretty well seal off the surface of the KO blanket. However, using this was in the original instructions for the build of this forge kit, and as such, I do intend to go forward using it just for the sake of completeness, pretty much. As you can probably tell, the surface of that blanket is now very rough, very fibrous, and very uneven because I've pulled out a lot of the KO that was kind of bonded or fused into the actual refractory cement. And unfortunately, that means there will be a bit of variation in the heat insulation properties of the blanket throughout the forge body, so to speak. Now, that also shouldn't be that big of a deal because this thing gets so hot regardless when the forge is on that I am not going to touch it for probably 1 to 2 hours even after I shut it down. So that shouldn't be a huge deal, and once I get it all cast with refractory cement, I think it will be a pretty good little replacement, so to speak, to itself, and hopefully last me at least another year before I need to replace the lining or replace the forge entirely. Now, I do have some ideas on how to cast this a little better than the first time I did it, but I need to get this rigidized and then let it dry for a couple of days, so I'm hoping to get this forge rebuilt and ready to use by the end of this next weekend. Now it is worth noting here that the original instructions had you rigidize the whole blanket front and back before putting it in the forge. However, mine is already installed and I did not want to try to pull it out and rigidize the whole thing. Theoretically, this is the only portion of the blanket that should be rigidized anyway, because now it's whatever is open to the air, and you're just trying to cover every square inch of real estate of this blanket, and you're supposed to use the whole bottle of the rigidizer. All right, so I emptied the spray bottle. This thing is now fully soaked. So I'm going to let this dry out and fully, hopefully, rigidize before I see you in a couple of days. Or like right now, your time. And just like that, through the magic of video editing, this is all dry. It is a couple days later, and I am getting ready to prep this thing for refractory cement. Now, the plan going forward is to use these polycarbonate sheets, which I will cut to dimension of the forge itself, and basically make it another pentagon inside the forge all the way through. Now, the original plan was to use 2 of these 3/4 inch pipe nipples to take up the space of the actual burner tube so that it doesn't fill in concrete either into the burner tube or create a seal that cuts off the burner tubes. However, these interior diameters are not a standard size for any piping nipple, which makes this significantly more difficult. So to get around that, I went and got a simple pine wood dowel from Ace Hardware. The plan is to sand this down to more of a taper and then cut it off at the length that I need it, and do that twice in order to have a plug that I can insert in from the center of the forge up through the burner tubes in order to plug those and prevent refractory cement from getting into the burner tubes. That's going to take a minute, so I'm not going to show you all of that, but I am going to clamp this to my workbench and get to work sanding a light taper into this so it fits into this tube, because even, unfortunately, this doesn't fit into the burner tubes themselves. So this is going to be a lot of prep work, but hopefully all of this extra work that I'm doing for this forge is going to get me a really nice, uniform texture and solid surface of refractory cement inside this forge in order to hopefully make this last a lot longer than the first time I made it. Now, the last time I put this forge together, I forgot to spray water into the blanket to wet it before I actually cast the refractory into it, and it absorbed too much water and caused a lot of premature cracking in the actual refractory cement itself. Hopefully I'm going to learn my lesson from that this time and spray this down before I actually pour the refractory cement in here, but I'm planning to do a slightly heavier, wetter mixture so that it's pourable as opposed to more of a clay or heavy cement, so to speak, so I can pour this in here into the mold, so to speak, and let it set and hopefully create a thicker layer of refractory cement that stays a lot longer as opposed to just a layer on the outside of the blanket. So fingers crossed, let's see how this goes. I'm cutting off just a piece of scrap pine that I had lying around from a previous project. This should be about nearly precisely the same width as the sheet of polycarbonate that I'm going to be cutting. And I'm just going to use this as kind of a way to avoid the acrylic sheet from flexing as I'm trying to cut it with the circular saw. So that's just hopefully going to make this a little bit safer in the process. Now let's see if this works. So I've already measured out my first cut here, and it occurs to me that maybe I should remove this film, but I think I'm going to leave it on for the first cut and see where it goes. So I'm just kind of eyeballing everything and cutting to at least the first one to dimension just to see where it kind of sits inside the forge, and then I'll cut kind of a bunch, more or less just by eye, in order to get a pentagon that sits inside the forge, smaller than the forge body and smaller than the KO blanket. And then I've got to figure out which one I need to do, but I'll need a 1-inch hole saw to drill/cut a hole through these in the spots where the burners go. So wish me luck and probably do things more precisely than I do. Turned out real nice. Not a ton of variation there. Let's see if it's square. Could be better. It does have a bit of variation. It's almost a bow, which is unfortunate, but I think given that this isn't going to be super precise to begin with, I think it'll be okay. Take that piece of tape off. Oh, and the film that came with it, and see where this fits inside the forge. I'm beginning to think this might actually not work. I'm gonna have to cut this slightly thinner because it is about the exact width of the floor, and in order to get a channel of refractory cement, especially on this side that has a really thick section of the KO wool blanket here. In order to get enough of a channel to get refractory cement all the way down, this needs to be skinnier. I might need to take it in by maybe a 1/2 inch. So we'll go ahead and do that and see if I can get my square actually square with it this time and clamped up. But you don't need to watch me do all of this. So we're gonna see you back here with 5 pieces of acrylic cut to hopefully the right size. After cutting the first piece of that acrylic and realizing that I don't currently have a good way to make sure it is perfectly square, and taping it all together is going to be a pain. And given that I really don't know how to get it like perfectly in line with the forge itself, I feel like I'm gonna have some weird taper or something in the forge, or otherwise mess up the burner tubes. I am going to just can that idea and go back to the original way that Mr. Volcano recommends you do this. So I'm going to fill that spray bottle up with some water just out of the sink, spray down the inside of the forge with that water to wet the blanket, and then start mixing the refractory cement. The instructions for the Mr. Volcano forges are very specific. There are 2 coats of refractory cement. The first coat is 2.25 pounds of the Satanite mixed with 9.94 fluid ounces of water, which come out to 10.37 ounces of weight of water specifically. So I'm gonna go get my scale. Hopefully I can find my shop scale and a bucket, and we're going to mix that up and start just hand applying. I'm gonna go find some gloves as well, and we're gonna hopefully get this thing refractory cemented, at least the first layer, done tonight. So it is 6:46 p.m. on a Sunday, and I gotta work tomorrow, which is why I decided to cut the rest of my efforts in making this a little more precise short, simply because I would like to get this forge done this weekend, or at least the first layer finished this weekend, so that I can hopefully try to use it, or at least cure it and use it next weekend, and get back to filming project videos, which I'm very excited about. So let's quit talking and let's get rocking. Alrighty, I found my scale. I got some gloves. I'm gonna make sure that I wear my safety glasses, because I don't want to get any of this stuff in my eyes. And I will be wearing breathing protection, because that is the 10 pounds of Satanite refractory cement that I got from Mr. Volcano, which I need to now scoop out and put into a bucket so I can mix up by hand to get a sour cream consistency. I've decided to make this first layer extra thick, so I am going to be taking an extra pound of Satanite out of this bag. So I'm gonna be getting 3.25 pounds as opposed to 2.25 pounds of refractory cement in the bucket, and then mixing that with 14.97 ounces of water by weight. Now that I have extra refractory cement, that's just to make sure that I have enough to coat the whole inside without having any extra uncovered square inches of blanket. So we're gonna get into this. This thing unfortunately turns itself off real fast, so I have to be pretty quick, so I'm not gonna talk my way through it, and you might not even be able to see the ounces, so just know the numbers will be on the screen. I'm doing what I read earlier off my phone. Hopefully this works. I decided to do kind of a hybrid approach of my previous method, or my intention rather, of just trying to lay this in here sideways and hopefully get enough of a layer not to mess it up. But this is unfortunately the hardest part of this process, and not because it's messing around with the goopy refractory cement, but because the refractory cement doesn't actually want to stick to the blanket. So you kind of end up pulling pieces of blanket off, and yes, also because it's goopy and sticks to your gloves. I could probably use a different set of gloves. I haven't tried that. But it's just frustrating trying to get this layer in Once this layer is in, it's a lot easier because the second layer just goes in on top of this one once the first layer of refractory cement is dry. But I'm just trying to gloop it on there as best as I can because glooping is really the best, unfortunately, the best way to do this. Is just layer it on there as thick as you can get it, because when you start to try to spread it to smooth out the surface, you gotta go really light or you'll rip the fibers out of the KO wool. And then you'll have a big patch where there's no refractory and no KO wool and nothing else there at all, unfortunately. I put a piece of that acrylic down in my tray forge to hopefully give me kind of a solid surface to lay this on that's not the forge itself. All of the refractory cement in the other face of the forge isn't gluing itself to the tray. You kind of got to dab this stuff, and it's actually rather frustrating, which is why I wanted to try to thin it down and make it a mold, basically, like cast it inside as opposed to layer it on. The process wasn't working for me, and I didn't want to continue wasting time with it, unfortunately. This stuff kind of weirdly smells like coffee. Now that I've taken my breathing protection off, it doesn't want to stick at all. I think, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to just grab this thing and kind of turn it over and lay everything down in a layer, one side at a time. So we're gonna probably cut here. I'm not gonna go cut the camera footage because now both my hands are just covered in goop, but we're gonna be done watching me do this, and hopefully we'll just cut to a successful layering of refractory cement into my forge. All right, so this is done with the first layer of refractory cement. I'm going to let this dry for 24 to probably 48 hours. I did do a lot of putting water in through the burner tubes to try to clear out the extra refractory cement that built up kind of over the hole. And as a result, we had a lot of water soak into the floor of the forge. So the intent will be to let this dry for the next probably 2 to 3 days before I do another layer and seal any cracks that come in. So yeah, I'm gonna leave this here on the floor. The reason I'm lying on the floor is because I needed to wash out the tray forge because it had a ton of refractory cement just in the floor of it. And I had to take it out and spray it down with a hose. So now I'm lying on the floor because I didn't want to put this back up, and I wanted to get the forge in the shot. So we'll see you in another couple of days, which to you will again be just a matter of seconds. So we'll see you later. Okay, so it is like 4 days later, and this thing is still not quite dry, or at the very least not quite dry on the floor. And I think that's, well, I know that's because when cleaning out the burner tubes, I let a lot of water kind of sit and soak into that floor, so it's taking a lot longer for the floor to dry than everything else. Now, as you can see, the inside of the forge, all of the refractory cement is very cracked. And I think that's due to a combination of things. I got the ratio of the refractory cement to water down perfectly, like nearly to the 0.1 of an ounce each time I mixed. However, I think due to the variations in the surface of the KO wool blanket, because I peeled off and pulled chunks of the KO wool blanket off with pieces of the refractory cement earlier in this video, combined with the fact that I used more refractory cement than is the recommended weight of cement. I think the way that combined was there was more mass for the blanket to hold up, so to speak, and it started to kind of pull and sag in certain ways, which caused a lot of cracking along the transition points from like the floor to the wall or the wall to the ceiling, etc. I don't personally think that this makes the forge unusable. There are points where I can see through the crack into the actual KO wool blanket, so odds are good this forge isn't going to last me too much longer and I may have to replace it in the near future. So anyway, I am going to do the dry out process here today. I am going to try to patch and fill all those cracks, but for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to move on. You don't really need to see the mixing process of the refractory cement or reapplying to try to seal those cracks. So let's get to that dry out process and hopefully get to use this forge this weekend. On second thought, I think I am going to at the very least mix up some more of that refractory cement, apply to the cracks, and hope that it will seal those things off for me and just kind of do a patch job for the cracks as opposed to a full-on layer of refractory cement here. Now, unfortunately, the ceiling seems to have gotten the absolute worst of it, and there was actually a very large chunk that, as I was turning the forge around and moving it around, it actually fell out of the ceiling. So I put a very large patch in there, and I'm going to leave it upside down for the next day or so to hopefully let all this stuff dry out. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to say that this first attempt at forge renovation has failed thus far, and we're just going to have to see how this goes over the next couple of days. But I may not be able to do projects starting up real soon, unfortunately. But we're gonna keep slapping this stuff on like it's a Band-Aid, and hopefully it'll all work out fine. I'm glad I started doing this here at 9 in the morning, because if I had waited till the afternoon, I wouldn't have 24 hours for this to dry, to hopefully do the dry out tomorrow. But we don't have to show a lot of this because you already got enough of this when I first put in all of the layers. So I'm gonna cut, and we'll see you hopefully during the dry out procedure. All right, so it has finally been 24 hours. And with the exception of the floor being pretty heavily cracked again, the ceiling and a lot of the seams that I sealed yesterday are actually doing pretty all right. The floor is less concerning for me because Mr. Volcano provided these. I have 2 fire bricks that go in here and kind of create a sort of subfloor for you to lay your steel on, which is really nice because as they get coated in forge scale, or heaven forbid you do any forge welding in here, those things will get messed up over time. So it gives you a nice subfloor that you can replace without having to replace the whole forge. Now, all of these surfaces are dry to the touch, which to me means it is time to do the actual dry out procedure that Mr. Volcano provides with these forges. In order to do that, I need to put the burners back in the burner tubes and get everything hooked up to my propane tank, and then hope that I have enough propane left in the tank to actually do the dry out procedure. So we're gonna get into that. So the Mr. Volcano instructions for curing, or the dry out procedure, which is what I've been calling it, curing the refractory coating is, after the second layer has been dried, you are now ready to cure the refractory to make it a one solid piece. The idea is to remove water that is still left in the refractory coating after the drying. It is very important to do this slowly by heating it up in the given time increments and letting it cool down. As soon as you see steam forming, turn it off. Don't rush this process. Now, the reason I'm talking through this in a voiceover is because I don't want to mess up my times. I'm going to be using my phone to keep track of these times, and I don't have to worry about this as we go. So we're going to do this process kind of, you're going to see a small bit of it as I do this voiceover, and I'm just going to do this until I get it to where I think it's correct. So the process starts with firing up the burners on low and keeping it on for 45 seconds. Low to me means as low in the gas as is possible to keep it actually burning without it sputtering too horribly. It does say that you should expect a bit of sputtering due to the humidity in the forge, as well as due to how low you have to keep the burners on. The next step is to turn off the forge and allow it to cool for 5 minutes, and then repeat the previous 2 steps, increasing the time in step A by 5 seconds to each interval until you don't see any more steam forming. Mark time 45 seconds. Trying to keep that as low as possible. And you can see the steam coming off it like crazy. And now I'm going to let that wait 5 minutes to cool down. You really want to not rush this process, because this step, if any of them, is going to be the one that causes extra cracking. You can already see my floor is pretty cracked as it is. I'll probably do a lot of patching since I have extra refractory cement. As I continue to use this forge, I'm just going to build up layers of patching to fill those cracks in and continue to do this process throughout the time. But we're going to wait 5 minutes, we're going to do it again. You can actually see the water seeping out. Must be still a lot of water packed into that blanket. So this is really needed in order to get all that moisture out of there. Now that's going to do it for today's forge renovation. I am stoked to have this forge back up and running, and I am very much looking forward to getting back to project videos, which is where this channel started and where I really want this channel to get back to. But that is going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, leave a comment, hit subscribe, ring that notification bell. If you want to support me and the channel further, please consider becoming an honorary striker on my Patreon. That link is in the description below the video, or please consider becoming a member on my YouTube channel. And as always, keep on rocking.